Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most people never really stop to see. Not because it's hidden, but because it looks too ordinary to matter. There is a room deep inside the entity, organization, British Museum, golden masks and towering statues, a quieter place where the light feels softer and time seems to slow down just enough for you to notice things you would normally walk past. I remember standing there in front of a small glass case, nothing impressive at first glance, just a few pieces of clay, cracked, brown, almost forgotten, but something about them made me stop, not because they looked important, but because they didn't. And yet, those fragments, known as part of the entity book, Epic of Atrahasis, ancient Epic of Atrahasis, or Thousand Years, quietly holding a story that feels strangely unfinished, a story that doesn't begin with creation, but with exhaustion. A story where the gods were not resting in the sky, but working, and not just working, suffering. The more I read, the more something started to feel off. Because these texts don't describe a world where humans were gifted life. They describe a world where something else went wrong first. And what followed may not have been creation at all, but replacement for a group of beings called the entity mythological group Igigi, Igigi, Usans of years. And when they finally couldn't endure it anymore, they did something that changed everything. They stopped, they gathered, and they made noise, not just sound, but something closer to a voice, a collective voice. And here's the part I can't seem to ignore, because later in the text, when humans appear, that same word shows up again, noise, and the gods, they didn't just hear it, they feared it. So tonight, I don't want to just tell you what these tablets say. I want to slowly walk through them with you, piece by piece, question by question, because the more I looked at these fragments, the more it started to feel like they weren't just recording a myth, but something closer to a memory, or maybe a warning. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. I didn't plan to spend much time there. Honestly, I almost walked past it like everyone else. The entity, organization, British Museum Enshin immediately. Towering statues, gold artifacts, names you already recognize. Places where crowds gather instinctively. And I followed that same path at first, moving with the noise, the cameras, the quiet excitement of people checking off things they had seen in books. But at some point, almost without thinking, I drifted away from that center, down a corridor that grew quieter with every step. The light dimmed slightly, the air felt different, and the footsteps around me became fewer until it was just a handful of people, walking slowly, or sometimes not stopping at all. This was the Mesopotamian section. And if I'm being honest, nothing there tries to impress you at first glance. No gold shining under spotlights. No massive structures designed to overwhelm you, just rows of glass cases and inside them small pieces of clay. They're easy to miss, really easy. Most people glance at them for a second, maybe read half a label and then move on, because they don't look like anything special, just fragments, brown, uneven, covered in tiny markings that don't make sense unless you already know what you're looking at. And I almost did the same. I remember slowing down for a moment, not because I understood what I was seeing, but because something about the stillness of that room felt different. Like it wasn't asking for attention, but quietly holding on to something. And I don't know why, but I stopped. Not in the way you stop for something impressive, but in that quieter way when something pulls your focus without explaining itself. I leaned a little closer to the glass, trying to make sense of the patterns pressed into the clay, small wedge-shaped marks repeated again and again, almost like footprints, or something left behind by someone who didn't expect to be understood thousands of years later. There was a label beneath it, simple, almost too simple, referencing fragments that were part of something called the Entity Book, Epic of Atrahasis, Ancient, Epic of Atrahasis lie, and maybe that's part of why I stayed, because there was no expectation, no prior story shaping what I thought I was about to learn, just a quiet curiosity. Around me, people continued to pass by, some slower than others, but most didn't stop. And I remember noticing how something that had survived for nearly 4,000 years, something that had been written carefully, deliberately, by someone who believed it mattered, could now sit in front of us, almost invisible. And that thought lingered a little longer than I expected, because it made me wonder, what kind of story gets preserved that long, but almost disappears anyway? What kind of story doesn't need attention, but somehow waits for it? I looked again at the surface of the clay, trying to imagine the moment it was written, someone pressing those marks into soft earth, line after line, not knowing who would read it or if anyone ever would. And there was something about that image that made the room feel even quieter. I wasn't reading the text yet, I didn't understand the legend, I didn't know the structure, but there was already a feeling, subtle but persistent, that this wasn't just a fragment of history, it felt unfinished. Like something had been recorded, but not fully explained. And that's when the thought came to me, slowly, almost reluctantly. If this story had lasted this long, and if it had once been important enough to preserve, then maybe it wasn't meant to be understood all at once. Maybe it was meant to be rediscovered, piece by piece. I don't remember standing there longer than I expected. But I remember standing there longer than I expected, longer than I usually would for something I didn't immediately understand. And even now, I can't really explain it clearly. I just know that something about those small, quiet pieces of clay made me stop longer than I should have. I stayed there a little longer than I expected, and eventually my eyes adjusted to the small differences between the tablets. Some were more worn than others. Some had deeper impressions, clearer lines. And then there were two fragments that seemed to sit almost quietly apart from everything else, not physically separated, but somehow different, as if they carried more weight than their size could justify. I leaned closer again, just enough to read the small printed label beneath the glass, BM 78941 and BM 78943. Simple numbers. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would catch your attention unless you were already looking for something. But for some reason, those numbers stayed with me. I didn't know what they meant yet. I didn't know their history, but I could tell from the way they were described that they weren't complete. They were fragments, pieces of something larger, something that once existed in full, but now only survived in parts. And that realization brought a different kind of stillness into the moment. Because there's something strangely unsettling about fragments. A complete object tells you where it begins and where it ends. It gives you boundaries, context, a sense of closure. But fragments don't do that. They leave gaps. They leave questions. They leave you trying to imagine what's missing. And standing there, looking at those two pieces of clay, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just looking at an ancient text. I was looking at something that had been broken. Not necessarily by accident, but by time, or loss, or maybe even by design. The label mentioned that these fragments were part of something called the Entity Book, Epic of Atrahasis, Ancient Epic of Atrahasis E, something connected to one of the oldest stories ever recorded. And yet, even that description didn't fully explain why these pieces felt different, because they weren't just old, they were incomplete. And somehow that made them feel more important, not less. I tried to follow the lines pressed into the clay, row after row of cuneiform marks, each one carefully made, each one part of a system that once carried meaning clearly, but now required translation, interpretation, reconstruction. And that's when another thought started to form, slowly, almost in the background. If these fragments are all that survived, then whatever story they belong to is being told to us in pieces. Not as it was originally written, but as it was left behind. And that changes something. because it means we're not just reading the story, we're rebuilding it line by line, fragment by fragment, trying to connect something that was never meant to be read this way. I step back slightly, just enough to take in both fragments at once. BM 7941, BM 78943, two pieces that once belonged to a larger whole, now separated, preserved, but incomplete. And I don't know why, but the longer I looked at them, the more it felt like something was missing on purpose. Not in the obvious sense, not like pages torn out of a book, but in a quieter way, like a story that continues, even after parts of it disappear. And that's when the feeling became clearer. This wasn't just a damaged text. It felt like a story that had been interrupted or maybe even altered. And standing there in that quiet part of the museum with people still passing behind me without stopping, I realized something that I hadn't expected to feel at all. It felt like I was looking at evidence, not proof of something specific, but evidence that whatever this story was originally trying to say, we're no longer hearing all of it. And that thought stayed with me longer than I was comfortable admitting. Because once you start looking at something like that, you can't really go back to seeing it as just another artifact. You start wondering, you start wondering, what exactly is missing? And more importantly, why? And I remember thinking very quietly to myself, this doesn't feel like a complete story anymore. It feels like something that's been torn apart and left for someone else to piece back together. I stayed with that thought for a while, longer than I expected, and eventually curiosity pulled me a little further, not physically this time, but inward toward the question that those fragments seem to be quietly asking. Because once you accept that something is missing, the next thing that naturally follows is wondering what the beginning actually looked like. And that's where things started to feel even more unusual. Most of the stories we grow up hearing, especially stories about origins, they begin in a very familiar way. There is nothing, and then something appears, a moment of creation, a beginning that feels clean, intentional, almost comforting in its clarity. But this wasn't like that. Not even close. Because the more I looked into the fragments of the entity book, Epic of Atrahasis, Ancient Epic of Atrahasis Ori doesn't begin with creation at all. It begins somewhere else entirely. And that somewhere else is what stayed with me. Because instead of describing how humans were made, the text seems more interested in what existed before them. And not just in a vague mythological sense, but in a very specific, almost grounded way. It describes a world that was already in motion, already structured, already divided. A world where roles had been assigned, and more importantly, a world where something wasn't working. I remember reading that part slowly, going back over it more than once, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the tone, because it didn't feel like the kind of beginning I was used to. There was no sense of wonder, no moment of light breaking through darkness. Instead, there was effort, repetition, weight, the kind of weight that builds over time, and that's when the realization started to settle in. Before humans ever existed in this story, something else was already happening, something ongoing, something demanding, and strangely, something exhausting. The text doesn't rush past this either. It doesn't treat it like background information. It lingers, it gives details, it counts time. And that's what made it feel real in a way I wasn't expecting. Because when a story takes the time to count, to measure, to describe effort in terms that feel almost physical, it stops feeling symbolic and starts feeling like memory. I found myself pausing again, not because I had reached a conclusion, but because the direction of the story itself felt different. It wasn't leading toward creation. It was leading toward a problem. And that shift matters more than it seems at first, because if a story begins with a problem instead of a beginning, then whatever comes next isn't just creation. It's a response, and that idea changes everything. I stood there thinking about that for a moment. If humans appear later in the text, then what were they responding to? Well, what situation required something new to exist? And why does the story feel like it's building toward that answer? instead of starting with it. The more I sat with that question, the more it started to feel like the fragments weren't just incomplete. They were pointing somewhere, gently, almost deliberately, towards something that happened before we were ever part of the story. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that something was, it wasn't peaceful, it wasn't balanced, and it definitely wasn't stable, because stories don't usually begin this way unless something has already gone wrong. And that thought, quiet as it was, stayed with me longer than I expected, because it meant that the real beginning of this story wasn't about us at all. It was about what came before us, and more importantly, what had already started to break. The more I stayed with that question, the more something began to shift, not in the text itself, but in the way I was reading it. Because up until that point, I was still holding on to a familiar assumption that whatever these fragments described, it would eventually return to something recognizable, something that fit the stories we've always been told. But then I reached a detail that didn't fit at all. It was subtle at first, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Just a few lines. Almost procedural in the way they were written, but the more I read them, the harder it became to ignore what they were actually saying, because according to these fragments of the entity book, Epic of Atrahasis, ancient Epic of Atrahasis anything that resembles our world took shape. The gods were working. I remember stopping there, not moving forward immediately, just letting that idea settle for a moment, because it didn't make sense, not in the way I understood these stories. Gods don't work. Not like that. They command, they create, they observe, but they don't dig, they don't carry weight, they don't repeat the same action over and over again until it wears something down inside them. And yet, that's exactly what the text describes, not in symbolic language, but in terms that feel almost physical. There are references to effort, to burden, to tasks that require time, not moments, but long stretches of existence, measured not in days, but in cycles so large they begin to feel impossible to imagine clearly. And what made it even more unsettling wasn't just the idea of work itself, it was the tone surrounding it, because this wasn't voluntary, it wasn't framed as purpose. It wasn't described as something noble or chosen. It felt imposed, assigned, expected, and that distinction changes everything. I found myself reading those lines again, slower this time, paying attention not just to what was being said, but to how it was being said, because there's a difference between describing an action and describing a condition. And this felt like a condition, a state that had been going on for a very long time, long enough for something to start breaking beneath the surface. And that's when the second realization followed. They weren't just working, they were enduring it. That word doesn't appear directly in the text, but the feeling of it does. You can hear it in the repetition, in the way the actions are described again and again, in the sense that nothing is changing, nothing is resolving, everything is continuing, and continuing, and continuing until it becomes something else entirely, something heavier, something harder to carry quietly. I leaned back slightly, just enough to break the focus for a moment, because that idea didn't sit comfortably, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so grounded, so specific, so strangely familiar in a way I couldn't immediately explain. And that's when the question formed more clearly than before. If the gods in this story were working, and not just working, but enduring something they didn't choose, then what exactly does that make them? And more importantly, who put them in that position? The text doesn't answer that immediately. It doesn't rush to explain or justify. It simply presents the condition and lets it sit there unresolved, almost like it expects you to notice the tension yourself. And I did. Because once you see it, you can't really unsee it. The idea that the world before humans wasn't a place of calm, divine order, but something closer to a system under strain, a system where even the ones we would call gods were carrying something they couldn't sustain forever. And that thought quiet as it was, began to shift everything that came after it. Because if this part of the story is accurate, even partially, then the arrival of humans later on isn't just creation, it's a response to pressure, a solution to a problem, and maybe even a replacement. I stood there a little longer, letting that settle, because it wasn't just a new piece of information. It was a different way of seeing the entire structure of the story. And once that structure changes, everything built on top of it changes too. The roles, the motivations, the decisions that follow, all of it starts to look different. And I remember thinking very quietly, almost without wanting to say it out loud, if this is true, even in part, then everything we think we understand about these stories, about gods, about creation, might not be as stable as it seems. And if that's the case, then the real question isn't just what happened next. It's whether we've been starting the story in the wrong place all along, because if the beginning isn't what we thought it was, then maybe everything that follows has been misunderstood too. And that realization stayed with me, long after I stepped away from those fragments, long after the room filled again with quiet footsteps and passing voices. Because once you consider it seriously, even for a moment, it becomes difficult to see these stories the same way again. If the gods were working and if they were suffering, then maybe the story we've been told about them was never the full story to begin with. The longer I stayed with that unsettling detail, the harder it became to ignore what the text was quietly revealing beneath the surface. Because once you accept that the gods in this story were not simply watching or creating, but actually working, the next question almost asks itself, who was giving the orders? And that's where the structure begins to emerge, slowly, carefully, almost as if the text doesn't want to say it too directly, but leaves enough for you to notice if you're paying attention. Because these fragments of the entity book, Epic of Atrahasis, Ancient Epic of Atrahasis, and as one, they describe something more layered, more organized, something that feels less like mythology and more like a system. Two groups appear again and again in the lines. The entity mythological group Anunnaki, Igigi, Igigi, different names for the same beings, different traditions, different translations, something like that. But the more I read, the clearer it became that they were not interchangeable at all. They had different roles, different positions, and more importantly, different experiences. The Anunnaki, at least in the way the text presents them, seem to occupy a place of authority. They are the ones who decide, who distribute roles, who establish the structure of how the world is supposed to function. They are not described as struggling. They are not described as carrying weight. They appear in moments of decision, of discussion, of command, and that alone sets them apart, because then there are the Igigi, and everything about how they are described feels different. The tone shifts, the language becomes heavier, more repetitive, more physical. The Igigi are not making decisions, they are carrying them out. They are assigned the tasks that keep everything else running, and those tasks are not abstract. They are grounded, specific, demanding, digging, carrying, shaping the world itself in a very literal way. I remember pausing there again, because something about that contrast felt too precise to ignore. This wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a division, a clear separation between those who decide and those who execute. And that distinction carries a weight of its own, because it introduces something that most mythological stories don't emphasize this directly: responsibility, or maybe more accurately, burden. And that's when the realization started to settle in more firmly. This wasn't a story about gods living in harmony, it was a story about a structure, a system where one group holds authority and another carries the cost of maintaining that authority. I leaned slightly closer again, almost instinctively, as if the physical distance might somehow change what I was seeing. Because the more I thought about it, the more familiar that structure began to feel. not in a direct way, not in something I could point to immediately, but in a quieter sense, like recognizing a pattern without fully naming it yet. And that recognition made the next detail even harder to ignore, because the text doesn't present this division as temporary. It presents it as something that has already been in place for a long time, long enough for it to become normal, long enough for it to go unquestioned, at least at first. And that's what makes it more unsettling. Because systems like that don't usually remain stable forever, not when one side carries everything and the other remains removed from that experience entirely. Something eventually builds, something accumulates. Pressure, fatigue, frustration. Even if the text doesn't name it directly at this stage, you can feel it forming beneath the surface. And I found myself thinking, if this structure really existed within the story, then the question isn't whether something would go wrong, the question is when and how. Because no system that depends entirely on one group carrying the weight for another remains unchanged indefinitely. And the text seems to understand that, even if it doesn't say it outright, because the way it describes the Igigi isn't just functional, it's cumulative. Everything they do, everything they carry, everything they repeat adds up. And when something keeps adding up without release, it eventually reaches a point where it can't continue the same way anymore. I stood there, still in that quiet space, letting that idea settle a little deeper. Because it wasn't just the roles themselves that mattered, it was the imbalance between them, the gap between command and execution, between decision and effort, between those who define the system and those who sustain it. And that gap, even in the earliest lines of this story, already felt too wide to hold forever. I kept thinking about imbalance, that quiet separation between those who decide and those who carry the weight. And the more I stayed with it, the more the text seemed to press into a detail that I almost missed the first time I read it. Not because it was hidden, but because it was stated so plainly that it didn't feel dramatic at first. A number. Just a number. 3,600 years. I remember going back to that line again and reading it slower, just to make sure I understood it correctly, because sometimes numbers in ancient texts are symbolic, exaggerated, meant to suggest something rather than define it. But this didn't feel symbolic. It felt deliberate, measured, counted, and that made it harder to ignore. Because 3,600 years isn't just a long time, it's an unimaginable one. Not a lifetime, not even a series of lifetimes, but something closer to a condition that stretches beyond what we can easily relate to. And the text doesn't just give that number and move on, it builds around it, it reinforces it, it describes what fills that time, and what fills it is work, not abstract work, but something very specific, very physical. The Igigi are described as digging the riverbeds, shaping the flow of water, carving out the channels that would later sustain life on Earth, the Tigris, the Euphrates, names that we still recognize today, and somehow that makes it feel even more real, because these aren't imagined places, they're part of a landscape that still exists, which means the work being described isn't just symbolic either. It's grounded in something tangible, something that once required effort, coordination, repetition. I found myself picturing it, not clearly, but enough to feel the rhythm of it. Digging, carrying, clearing, again and again and again, without pause, without change, without relief. And that's when the weight of the number started to shift, because it's one thing to hear 3,600 years as a concept, but it's something else entirely to imagine what fills those years. Every moment accounted for by the same action, the same movement, the same demand, repeated until it stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like something you're trapped inside. I leaned back slightly, letting that image settle, because there's something about repetition over time that changes how we understand effort. A difficult task done once can be endured, even repeated for a while, but stretched across something like 3,600 years, it becomes something else entirely. it becomes strain, accumulated strain, the kind that doesn't show itself immediately, but builds quietly, layer by layer, until it reaches a point where it can't stay contained anymore. And the text seems to understand that. Even if it doesn't say it directly, because it doesn't describe the Igigi as adapting or accepting their role, it describes them as continuing, endlessly, almost mechanically, until the continuation itself becomes the problem. And that's where the line that stayed with me the most appears. Not emphasized, not dramatized, just stated, as if it doesn't need to be explained. They worked, and they counted the years of their burden. That word, counted. It changes something, because it suggests awareness. It suggests that they knew how long this had been going on, that they were tracking it, measuring it, feeling the accumulation of time in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And I remember thinking, that's not passive endurance. That's something much closer to waiting for something to change, or maybe waiting until it can't continue the same way anymore. Because when time is counted like that, it's not just passing, it's building towards something, and I don't know why. But that detail stayed with me longer than anything else in that section, because it made everything feel less like a distant myth and more like a process, a slow buildup of pressure, the kind that doesn't explode immediately, but becomes inevitable over time. I looked again at those fragments in my mind. BM Vens of 7899941, BM 7894333 at the file 0 and tried to IAS, pressing each mark into clay, recording, not just events, but duration, because writing something like that down means it mattered. It means it was meant to be remembered, not just that the work happened, but how long it lasted. And that detail alone changes how you see everything that follows. Because if something continues for that long, without relief, without adjustment, without any indication that it will end, then whatever comes next isn't sudden. It's the result of something that has been building for a very long time. And I remember thinking quietly, almost instinctively, this isn't just about work anymore. This is about how long something can be endured before it stops being sustainable and becomes something else entirely, something that no longer continues quietly, something that begins to push back. Because 3,600 years isn't just time, it's pressure, and pressure, when it builds long enough, doesn't disappear, it changes form. By the time I reached this part of the text, something already felt inevitable. Not because the story told me directly what was about to happen, but because everything leading up to it had been building in one direction, quietly, steadily, over a span of time that was almost impossible to fully comprehend. 3,600 years of repetition, of weight, of endurance, doesn't just disappear, it transforms. And then, it does. But not in the way I expected, because when I first imagined what a rebellion among gods might look like, I thought of chaos, something sudden, loud, uncontrolled, a kind of explosion after too much pressure. But that's not what the text describes. Not at all. It describes something much more precise, much more deliberate, and strangely, much more controlled. I remember reading the lines again, slower this time, because the tone had shifted, but not into chaos, into clarity. There's a moment when the Igigi stop what they're doing, not gradually, not by fading out, but by choosing to stop. And that choice changes everything, because it means the action that follows isn't reaction anymore, it's decision. They don't just abandon their tools, they burn them. The spades, the picks, the instruments that defined their existence for thousands of years, set on fire, not as an act of destruction alone, but as something symbolic. A break, a refusal to continue, and that detail stayed with me longer than I expected. Because burning something you've used for that long means you're not planning to return to it, it's final, intentional, and it carries a message. I stepped back for a moment when I realized that, because this wasn't frustration anymore. This was structure. The text describes them gathering and speaking to each other, not shouting, not panicking, but organizing, There's even a voice among them, a figure who speaks, who calls the others together, who frames what they're about to doing shifted completely, because this wasn't chaos, it was coordination. They decide to move together at a specific time in the middle watch of the night. And that detail matters because it suggests awareness, planning, timing. They're not reacting impulsively, they're choosing the moment, and then they go, not scattered, not uncertain, but as a group, toward the place where authority resides, toward the dwelling of entity, mythological figure, Enlil, me Enlil. At that moment was quieter than I expected. Not a storm, not noise in the usual sense, but presence. A group arriving together, surrounding something, holding their position. And that's when the word that appeared earlier in the text starts to echo differently. Noise, but not noise as chaos. Noise as voice. Collective voice, the kind that forces attention, the kind that can't be ignored. And I remember pausing there again, because something about that moment felt too familiar. Not in a direct sense, but in the pattern of it. The build-up, the endurance, the decision to stop, the gathering, the movement toward authority. It all followed a structure that didn't feel random at all. It felt learned. Almost as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because if this rebellion was organized, if it was intentional, if it was directed, then it wasn't just an event, it was a statement, a clear message from one group to another. And the message wasn't hidden, it was direct. The burden is too much. The work cannot continue like this. Something has to change. And what makes it even more striking is how the text describes the response, or rather, the lack of immediate response, because the ones in power, they don't anticipate this. They don't see it coming. Even a moment of surprise, a realization that something has shifted outside their control. And that detail changes the dynamic entirely, because it means that even within this structure, even within a system that seemed stable for thousands of years, there were limits that had been reached, and once reached, couldn't be ignored anymore. I remember thinking quietly, almost instinctively, this isn't just a rebellion. It's a turning point, the moment where endurance becomes action, where silence becomes voice, where something that has been carried for too long finally refuses to continue. And the more I sat with that moment, the clearer it became. This wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of everything that follows. After that moment, after the gathering, after the tools were burned, and the silence of endurance finally turned into something that could no longer be ignored, I expected the next part of the story to move toward resolution, something direct, something that would acknowledge the weight that had been carried for so long, but it didn't happen that way. Not at all. Because instead of an immediate change, instead of relief, the text describes something else entirely, a meeting, a council, the ones in authority, the entity, mythological group Anunnaki. Anunnaki alone tells you something important, because when a system responds to pressure by gathering its decision makers, it means the situation has moved beyond control. It requires agreement, deliberation, a unified response. And I remember slowing down again when I reached this part, because this is where I thought everything would shift. This is where the burden would be acknowledged, where the imbalance might finally be corrected, where the work would be shared or at least reduced. But the text doesn't move in that direction, not even slightly. The Igigi have already made their position clear. The work is too much. It cannot continue the way it has been. That part isn't debated. It isn't questioned. It's accepted as fact. And that's what makes the next decision feel even more unsettling, because the council doesn't ask how to make the system fair. They don't ask how to redistribute the weight. They don't even consider stepping into the labor themselves. Instead, they look for another solution, a different path entirely. And that's the moment where something already begins to shift in a way I wasn't expecting. Because up until now, everything has followed a certain logic, cause and effect, pressure leading to action, action leading to response. But this next step breaks that pattern. It doesn't resolve the imbalance, it bypasses it. And that distinction stayed with me longer than I expected, because bypassing a problem isn't the same as solving it. It's a way of preserving the structure while removing the pressure from the surface, and that's exactly what this decision feels like. The council reaches a conclusion, not about how to change the system, but about how to keep it running, without interruption, without collapse, without requiring those in power to alter their position at all. I leaned back slightly when that realization settled in, because once you see it that way, the decision stops feeling like a solution and starts feeling like a substitution. Something new will take the place of what can no longer continue, something that can carry the same weight, perform the same function, without resistance. At least that's the assumption. And that's where the tone of the text becomes even more precise, because it doesn't describe this as an act of creation driven by wonder or intention. It describes it as a response to necessity, a calculated move, designed to restore balance without changing the hierarchy that created the imbalance in the first place. And that's the part that stayed with me the most, because it reframes everything that follows. It suggests that what comes next isn't the beginning of something new, but the continuation of something old through a different form. And I remember thinking quietly, almost reluctantly, if that's true, then whatever is about to be created isn't just life, it's a replacement, a substitute for something that refused to continue the way it was before. And that idea carries a weight of its own, because it means the origin of that new thing is tied directly to the problem it was meant to solve, not separate from it, not independent of it, but shaped by it, defined by it, and simply even limited by it. The text doesn't rush this moment either. It lets it settle. It lets the implication form slowly, almost as if it expects you to arrive at the conclusion on your own. And when I did, it didn't feel dramatic, it felt quiet, but undeniable. Undeniable. The council had made its decision, not to reduce the burden, not to change the system, but to introduce something else, something that could take the place of those who had finally stopped. And I remember standing there, thinking about that shift. Because once you understand it that way, the story isn't about rebellion anymore. It's about what comes after, what fills the space that rebellion creates, and whether that new presence will follow the same pattern or change it entirely. And that's where the thought settled, slowly, clearly, almost without needing to be said out loud. They didn't solve the problem, they replaced it. And what they chose to create next would carry everything that came before it, whether it understood that or not. And that's when the realization became impossible to ignore, because the decision wasn't abstract anymore. It was specific, deliberate, and already in motion. They had chosen a different path, not to ease the burden, but to move it from one group to something else entirely. And the text leaves you right there at the edge of that moment, just before the next step is revealed, as if it wants you to feel the weight of that decision first, before showing you what it leads to. And I remember thinking, very quietly, almost instinctively, they decided not to change the system. They decided to build something that would live inside it, something that could carry what the others no longer would, something that could take their place. And for a moment, I hesitated before reading further, because the implication was already clear enough. They weren't just creating life, they were creating a replacement. I remember hesitating before moving forward, not because I didn't want to know what came next, but because the implication of that decision already felt heavy enough on its own. If something was about to be created, not out of wonder, not out of intention, but as a response to pressure, then whatever it was would carry that origin inside it, whether it understood it or not. And that thought stayed with me as I continued reading, slowly, carefully, almost as if the text itself required a different pace at this point. Because when it finally begins to describe the creation itself, it doesn't do it the way I expected. There's no sudden moment of light, no clean beginning, no clear separation between before and after. Instead, there is a process, layered, deliberate, almost technical in the way it unfolds. And the first thing that stood out to me was how physical it felt. Not symbolic, not abstract, but material. The text describes clay, not as an idea, but as substance. Something that can be shaped, pressed, formed by hand. And that alone already changes the tone. Because clay isn't something that appears instantly. It requires contact, it requires effort, it requires intention applied over time. But then something else is introduced into that clay. Something that doesn't belong to the earth. Something taken from the divine itself, the blood of a god. I remember stopping there again, because that detail didn't feel incidental, it felt necessary, as if clay alone wasn't enough, as if something living, something aware had to be added into the mixture. And the text makes it clear this wasn't a random element. A god is chosen, not for creation, but for sacrifice. That distinction matters more than it seems at first, because it means that what follows isn't simply the beginning of life, it's the result of something being ended, something being broken apart, so that something else can exist in its place. And that shift changes everything. I leaned back slightly when that realization settled in, because this didn't feel like creation anymore. It felt like transformation, or maybe even transfer, the life of one being becoming the foundation of another. And then there's one more detail, quieter, but just as important. The essence of the Igigi, described in a way that might seem almost insignificant at first, they contribute something of themselves, something physical, something that enters the mixture, not separate from it, but part of it. And that's where the image becomes even more complex, because now it's not just clay and blood, it's a blending, a combining of elements that were never originally meant to exist together: earth, divinity, memory, all pressed into the same form. And I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this doesn't feel like something entirely new. It feels like something assembled, something constructed from what already existed. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because it changes how you see the result. If something is created from nothing, it stands alone, independent. But if something is made from parts, then it carries those parts with it. It inherits them, whether it recognizes them or not. And that's when the realization became clearer. What the text is describing here isn't creation in the way we usually imagine it. It's mixture, combination, almost like a reconfiguration of what already exists. And I remember thinking quietly, almost without wanting to say it out loud, this doesn't feel like creating life, it feels like repurposing it. And that difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Because if what we're looking at here is not the beginning of something entirely new, but the continuation of something older through a different form, then whatever is being created in this moment isn't separate from what came before. It's connected to it in ways that might not be immediately visible, but are impossible to remove. The clay holds the shape, the blood carries the memory, the essence binds it together, and the result is something that exists between categories, not fully one thing, not fully another. And that ambiguity is what stayed with me the most, because it suggests that whatever emerges from this process will carry more than just life. It will carry history, pressure, and perhaps even the unresolved tension that led to its creation in the first place. I stood there for a moment longer in that quiet space, letting that idea settle, because once you see it that way, the question isn't just how humans were created, it's what exactly was passed into them, and whether that transfer was ever meant to remain hidden. Because if this really is a mixture, if something divine was placed into something earthly, then whatever comes next in the story won't just be about survival, it will be about inheritance. And I don't know why, but that thought felt heavier than anything that came before it. because it suggests that the origin of humanity isn't just the beginning, it's a continuation of something that never really ended, just changed form. I thought I understood what the text was doing at that point. Clay, blood, a sacrificed god. It already felt heavier than I expected from a creation story, more layered, more intentional. But then there was a detail, small enough to overlook if you weren't reading carefully, something that could easily be dismissed as symbolic, almost incidental. And yet, the longer I stayed with it, the more it began to feel like the center of everything. Because after the clay is prepared, after the blood is added, the text describes something else, the Igigi, the very beings who had carried the burden for thousands of years. They participate, not from a distance, not as observers, but directly. They contribute something of themselves. And the way it is described is almost too simple. They spit into the clay. I remember pausing there, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I wasn't sure how to interpret them. At first, it felt dismissive, like an afterthought, something added to complete a ritual. But the more I thought about it, the more that interpretation began to fall apart, because nothing else in this process is casual. Nothing is unnecessary. Every element has a purpose. Every action is part of something constructed carefully, deliberately. So why include this? Why make it collective? Why involve the Igigi at all? That's when the meaning began to shift. Because if this were only about replacement, if the goal were simply to create something to take over the labor, then clay and blood would have been enough. Form and life, structure and function. But this goes further than that. It adds something shared, something distributed across all of them. Not one god, not a single source, but many, all contributing, all leaving something behind. And that's when the idea became harder to ignore. This isn't just construction, it's transmission. Something is being passed into the mixture, something that doesn't belong to the earth alone, and not just to the sacrificed god either, but to the group as a whole. I leaned back slightly when that realization settled in, because it changes the entire meaning of what's being created. If the Igigi are part of this process, then what emerges from it doesn't just replace them, it carries them in some form, in some way that isn't immediately visible, but can't be removed. And that's when the detail that seemed small at first began to feel much larger, because in the context of ancient practices, what is transferred physically often carries essence, meaning, identity. It's not just an action, it's a way of embedding something into something else. And I remember thinking, quietly, almost reluctantly, if they are all contributing something of themselves, then what is being created here is not separate from at all. It is composed of them, not entirely, but enough to matter, enough to leave a trace. And that thought lingered longer than I expected, because it suggests that what follows in the story isn't just about humans appearing, it's about something continuing through a different form, a different structure, but with a connection that remains intact beneath the surface. And the more I considered that, the more the earlier events began to shift in meaning, the rebellion, the burden, the refusal to continue. All of it doesn't end when the Igigi stop working. It transforms into something that now exists within what replaces them. And that's where the line between replacement and inheritance begins to blur. Because if something only replaces another thing, it stands in its place. But if something inherits from it, it carries its history, its tension, its unresolved state. And that distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. I remained there, in that quiet mental space the fragments had created, trying to hold on to that idea clearly, because it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a doorway into a different way of reading the entire text, not as a story about gods and humans, but as a story about continuity, about how something doesn't simply disappear. It changes form. It finds another way to exist. And I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about moving it, embedding it, allowing it to continue in a way that might not be immediately recognized. And if that's true, then what was placed into humanity in that moment wasn't just life, It was a part of something older, something that had already endured too much, something that had already reached its limit. And now, instead of ending, it had been passed on, quietly, almost invisibly, into something that would carry it forward, whether it understood it or not. I thought the most unsettling part was already behind me. The mixture of clay and blood, the quiet participation of the Igigi, the sense that something had been carried forward rather than simply created. But then I reached a word, just one word, repeated in a way that didn't feel accidental. And the longer I stayed with it, the more everything began to shift again. The word is often translated simply as noise. And at first, it doesn't seem particularly important. It sounds ordinary, harmless, something easy to overlook. But the more I read the surrounding lines, the more that translation began to feel incomplete, because the word used, rigmu, doesn't only mean sound, it can mean voice, outcry, expression, something that carries intention, something that demands attention, and that changes everything. I remember pausing again, longer this time, because suddenly, this wasn't just about humans making sound. It was about humans carrying something within them, something that resembled what came before. The same quality the Igigi used when they gathered, when they spoke together, when they refused to continue in silence. That same capacity appears again, but now it's inside something new. And that's when the realization began to feel uncomfortable. Because if noise were only a side effect of life, it wouldn't need to be emphasized like this. It wouldn't appear again and again at key moments in the text, but it does. Every time the balance begins to shift, every time the system starts to react, this word returns, and each time it does, it carries more weight, because the text doesn't describe the gods as being disturbed by activity. It describes them as being disturbed by this noise specifically. And not just disturbed, but unable to ignore it, unable to rest because of it. And that's where the meaning begins to deepen, because if something prevents rest, if something disrupts a system at its core, then it's not just background sound, it's influence, it's pressure, it's presence. And I remember thinking almost instinctively, this sounds less like noise and more like voice, collective voice, the kind that builds when individuals begin to align, the kind that carries meaning beyond the individual level. And once that idea formed, it became difficult to see the earlier rebellion as isolated, because now there's a connection. The Igigi made noise, and that noise forced attention, forced change. And now that same capacity exists within humanity, not as something learned over time, but as something embedded from the beginning. And that's when the thought became harder to ignore. If this rigmu is truly part of what defines humanity in the text, then it isn't accidental, it's intentional, placed there, carried forward. And that means whatever humans are in this story, they are not neutral. They are not neutral. They are not passive. They are not simply tools created to maintain a system. They contain something that can disrupt that system, something that can challenge it. And that's where the discomfort begins to settle in, because it reframes everything that follows. The growth of humanity, the reaction of the gods, the attempts to reduce the population, all of it starts to look less like a response to quantity and more like a response to quality, to what humans are capable of becoming. And I remember standing there, or at least feeling like I was still standing in that quiet space, letting that idea settle slowly, because it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, but it changed the direction of the entire story. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about expression, about the presence of something within humanity that could not remain silent indefinitely, something that echoes the past without necessarily remembering it. And that's when I realized, quietly, almost reluctantly, this is the moment where the story stops feeling distant and starts feeling close, because if this noise is part of what defines humanity in the text, then it isn't something external. It isn't something that appears later. It's something that was there from the beginning. And that means every region that follows in the story is a reaction to that presence, not just to what humans do, but to what they are. And I don't know why. But that realization felt different from everything else that came before it, heavier, more immediate, because it suggested something I hadn't considered until that moment, that what disturbed the gods wasn't just the existence of humanity, but something within humanity that refused to remain quiet, something that carried forward the same pattern that had already once changed everything. And that's when the thought became impossible to ignore. This is the point where I began to feel very clearly that something in this story was not as stable as it first appeared. The more I sat with that idea of noise, of something placed inside humanity that felt less like sound and more like a voice, the harder it became to treat everything before it as isolated events. Because once you begin to connect those details, the mixture of clay and blood, the participation of the Igigi, the transfer of something that carries awareness, and now this Rigmu that refuses to remain silent, a pattern begins to form, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, and that's where another concept starts to surface. Not always translated directly, not always explained in full, but present in the structure of the text itself, a binding, a tie, something that connects one state to another in a way that cannot simply be undone. The term often associated with this idea is Rikiltu, and I remember pausing again when I began to sense its implications, not because it was highlighted clearly, but because it seemed to exist just beneath everything that had already happened. Because if you follow the sequence carefully, the Igigi endure the burden, they reach a limit, they act together, they force a change, and in response something new is created. But that creation isn't separate from them, it involves them. Their presence, their essence, their contribution becomes part of what replaces them. And that's where the idea of a Rikiltu begins to make sense, not as a written agreement, not as something spoken aloud, but as something embedded within the act itself. A connection formed through the process, a continuity that cannot be easily removed. Because if something is created using parts of what came before, then it carries a relationship to that origin, whether that relationship is acknowledged or not. And I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this doesn't feel like a simple transfer of labor. It feels like a binding, something that links the Igigi to what comes after them, not symbolically, but structurally. And that idea begins to explain something the text never states directly, why the presence of humanity continues to provoke such strong reactions later in the story, why the noise matters so much, why the attempts to reduce or eliminate humanity escalate the way they do. Because if there is a connection, if something of the Igigi continues within humanity, then the creation of humans doesn't end the problem. It transforms it. It relocates it. It allows it to continue in a different form. And that's where the concept of Rikiltu becomes more than just a word. It becomes a lens, a way of understanding everything that has happened so far as part of a continuous structure rather than separate events. I leaned back slightly again, letting that idea settle, because it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a shift in perspective, a realization that the story I thought I was reading about creation, about God as in humans, might actually be about something else entirely. Something that doesn't begin and end in clean moments, but carries forward through transformation, through inheritance, through subtle connections that are never fully stated. And that's when the thought became clearer. If there is a Rikiltu here, if there is a binding between what existed before and what was created after, then humanity in this story is not simply a new beginning. It is a continuation of something that had already reached its limit, something that had already resisted, something that had already refused to remain silent. And now, instead of ending, it exists again in a different form, carrying the same potential, the same tension, the same capacity to disrupt what once seemed stable. And I remember thinking very quietly, almost as if I wasn't sure I wanted to say it out loud, maybe this wasn't just about creating humans at all. Maybe it was about ensuring that something didn't disappear, even if it changed shape, even if it became something unrecognizable at first. And that thought lingered longer than anything else, because it changes the meaning of everything that follows. If humanity is part of a continuation, then every action taken against it later in the story is not just about control. It's about severing that connection, breaking that re-kill to, ending something that was never meant to persist. And yet, despite everything that comes next, that connection never seems to disappear completely. It remains quietly beneath everything. And I remember standing there in that quiet space, letting that idea settle one last time, because it didn't feel like a theory anymore. It felt like a possibility. The text itself was quietly pointing toward, not stating directly, but allowing you to see if you were willing to follow the pattern far enough. And the more I followed it, the more it felt like the conclusion was never hidden at all. It was simply never spoken aloud. Maybe this wasn't just the creation of humanity. Maybe it was the creation of a continuation, something that carries forward what came before, in a way that cannot be easily erased. I thought the most important part of the story had already happened: the rebellion, the decision, the creation, the quiet possibility of a connection that should not have continued. But as I moved further into the text, something began to shift again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, in the way change often moves when it begins beneath the surface. Because after the creation, there is no immediate conflict, no instant reaction, no collapse of the system. Instead, there is time in which something new begins to take shape. And that shaping feels quiet at first, almost unremarkable, almost natural. The humans begin to multiply, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until what began as something small becomes something that fills the land. And the text does not describe this as a problem, not yet. It presents it as growth, expansion, the natural continuation of life. But there is something in the way it is described that feels different, because it does not focus on individuals. It focuses on scale, on how the land itself begins to change as the number of humans increases. And that detail matters, because it shifts the perspective from existence to impact, from simply being present to altering everything around them. I remember pausing again when I noticed that shift, because this was no longer just about survival. It was about construction, about humans building, organizing, forming structures that had not existed before. And that is where the change becomes more visible. Because once a group begins to organize, it stops being just a collection of individuals. It becomes something else entirely, a system, a network, something that can sustain itself beyond any single part. And the text hints at this quietly, not through dramatic language, but through implication. Humans are no longer just present. They are active. They are shaping the world in ways that begin to resemble what came before them. And that similarity becomes difficult to ignore once it is seen, because earlier in the story, the Igigi were described as working the land, digging, maintaining, creating the structure that allowed everything else to function. And now, something very similar is happening again, but this time, it is happening through humans, not in exactly the same way, but close enough that the pattern begins to repeat. And that is when the feeling begins to change, because what seemed like simple growth at first begins to feel like continuation. The work has not disappeared. It has been transferred, carried forward, embedded into a new form that now expands on its own. And I remember thinking quietly, if this is true, then the system did not end when the Igigi stopped working. It evolved. It found another way to sustain itself through something that now exists in far greater numbers. And that is where scale becomes important, because a single group carrying a burden can be limited, contained, controlled, but a growing population, a system that expands beyond boundaries, that becomes something else entirely, something harder to manage, harder to predict, and perhaps impossible to stop once it reaches a certain point. I leaned back again, letting that idea settle slowly, because the text does not say directly that this growth is dangerous, not yet, but it begins to frame it with tension. Something is changing, not just in number, but in presence, in impact, in the ability to shape the world itself. And that is when another thought begins to form. If humans carry something of what came before, if they inherit that same capacity for action, for organization, for collective presence, then this growth is not just expansion, it is amplification. The same pattern, now multiplied, spread across a much larger scale, and that changes everything that follows. Because what once existed within a single group now exists across an entire population, and that population is still growing, still building, still shaping, in ways that cannot easily be reversed. And I remember thinking, this is the point where the story begins to shift again. Not because something has gone wrong, but because something has become too large to ignore, too present, too influential. And even though the reaction has not yet been described, you can already feel it approaching. Because systems built on control do not remain stable when something begins to expand beyond their reach. And that is where the quiet tension of this moment begins to build. Because the growth of humanity is not just the continuation of life, it is the beginning of something that will eventually be seen as a problem, even if it does not feel like one yet. And I do not know why, but that realization felt heavier than the ones before it. Because this time, nothing has gone wrong yet, and still, something about it already feels unstable. At first, it would have been easy to believe that what was happening was simply growth, more people, more movement, spreading across the land, something natural, something expected after creation. But the text doesn't leave it there. It returns to a word that had already appeared before, a word that once felt small, almost insignificant, noise. And this time, it feels different, because now it doesn't appear as something placed quietly within humanity. It appears as something rising from them, something expanding alongside their growth. And the tone begins to shift, not just sound, not just the background presence of life continuing, but something louder, more persistent, something that demands to be noticed. I remember slowing down again at that moment, because the repetition no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate, as if the text was guiding attention back to something we had already seen, but now on a much larger scale. And that's where the meaning deepens, because if this were only about sound, it wouldn't carry this kind of weight. It wouldn't provoke reaction. It wouldn't be described as disturbance, but it is. The noise of humanity becomes something the gods cannot ignore, something that reaches them, interrupts them, prevents rest. And that's where the shift becomes clear. Because once something disrupts a system at that level, it stops being background. It becomes influence, pressure, presence that cannot be dismissed. And I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this doesn't feel like noise anymore. It feels like structure. Because what the text is describing isn't random sound. It's the result of people acting together, living together, organizing their existence into patterns, patterns that repeat, patterns that grow, patterns that begin to resemble something larger than any individual. And that's when the connection becomes impossible to ignore, because earlier in the story, the Igigi made noise too, not chaotic, not meaningless, but organized, directed, focused. They gathered, they spoke, they acted as one, and that collective presence forced a response. And now, that same kind of presence is appearing again, but not through them, through humanity. And the scale is different this time, larger, more distributed, less contained, and that changes everything. Because a single group acting together can be confronted, addressed, contained within a moment, but a population spread across the land, organizing in ways that are not always visible, that is something else entirely. Something that builds pressure differently, not from one point, but from many at once. And I remember pausing there because the more I thought about it, the more familiar the pattern began to feel, not in detail, but in structure. The way something small becomes collective, the way collective presence becomes influence, the way influence becomes pressure, and eventually something that cannot be ignored. And that's when the thought formed clearly, quietly, almost without needing to be spoken. This is familiar, not in what it is, but in how it unfolds, the buildup, the organization, the shift from individuals into something that acts as a whole. And that recognition made everything feel closer than before, because this wasn't just something in a distant past anymore. It was a pattern that repeats, a structure that emerges whenever enough individuals begin to align, and that is what gives the noise its meaning here. It isn't just sound, it is alignment, coordination, the presence of something that begins to act together, and that is what makes it powerful, and also what makes it threatening to a system built on control, because control depends on separation, on isolation, on the absence of unified direction. But once something begins to organize, once it begins to act as one, the balance shifts. And I remember thinking, if this is what the text is pointing toward, then the reaction that follows is not about irritation, it is about recognition. Recognition of something that has already happened once before. Recognition of a pattern returning, but this time on a scale that may no longer be contained in the same way. And that is where the tension becomes clearer. Because the noise is not just increasing, it is evolving, becoming more structured, more intentional, more difficult to ignore. And the more it grows, the more it begins to resemble something that had already once forced change in the system. And that's when the realization settled in again, quietly, steadily. This isn't just about sound, this is about pressure returning. Is in a form that looks different on the surface, but carries the same underlying pattern. And if that pattern is recognized, then what follows will not be random. It will be deliberate, a response to something that feels familiar enough to be seen as a threat. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because it meant that what the gods were reacting to wasn't just what humanity had become, but what it reminded them of. Once I began to see the noise as something more than sound, the next part of the text felt different, heavier, because the reaction that follows no longer seems random. It begins to take shape as a sequence, a pattern, a deliberate attempt to reduce not only the number of humans, but the force that was rising through them. And that is what made me slow down again, because the text does not move directly to the flood, not yet. Before that final erasure, there are stages, 3 distinct pressures placed on humanity, each one more severe than the last. And the first begins with the body. Disease, something that enters quietly, almost invisibly, and begins to weaken people from within. And I remember noticing how precise that felt, because if you want to silence something that is growing, you do not begin by confronting its voice. You begin by weakening the body that carries it. Breath becomes difficult, strength fades, ordinary movement begins to break apart, the rhythm of daily life loses its stability. And yet, humanity does not disappear. Somehow, through warning, through adaptation, through something that allows them to endure, they continue. And so the pressure changes form. The second stage turns toward the land itself. Drought. The sky closes. The rain does not come, the rivers no longer respond, and this is no longer only about the body. It is about the foundation beneath it. Food, water, the systems that allow life to continue, because people can endure pain for a time, but when the land stops answering them, everything begins to tighten, resources shrink, movement slows, fear enters quietly into every space, and again, the discomfort deepens. Because this does not feel like punishment, it feels like strategy. First weaken the body, then weaken the foundation that sustains it. And when even that is not enough, the third pressure arrives, famine. And famine is different, because famine does not only empty the body, it begins to fracture the connections between people, family, trust, the invisible agreements that hold a society together. Hunger changes behavior, changes decisions, changes what people are forced to become. And I remember sitting with that part longer than I expected, because by then, the pattern had become too clear to ignore. Disease targets the body, drought targets the environment, famine targets the structure of society itself. One layer after another, as if the goal is not simply to reduce life, but to dismantle the conditions that allow it to exist collectively. And that word matters. Collectively. Because if the noise is truly voice, organization, pressure, then silencing it is not only about reducing individuals, it is about breaking the connections between them, making them too weak to gather, too unstable to organize, too isolated to act as one. And that is when the deeper tension beneath the story becomes visible, not a fear of individuals, but of unity. Because when people exist together, they begin to resemble what came before. They begin to carry the same pattern again: endurance, organization, resistance, and each attempt to reduce them feels aimed at cutting that pattern apart, first through sickness, then through scarcity, then through desperation. But still, it does not end there. And that is what makes it more unsettling, because each time pressure is applied, something remains weakened, but not erased. Something continues beneath the surface. And I remember thinking, very quietly, that perhaps this is why the final act becomes inevitable within the logic of the text. Not because the earlier attempts were small, but because they failed. They failed to fully sever the connection, failed to fully silence what had been placed within humanity from the beginning. And once that became clear, these stages no longer felt like separate events. They felt like a progression, a narrowing of possibility, a systematic attempt to dismantle body, land, and society until nothing could remain strong enough to respond. And yet, even then, something still does. Something continues to move beneath everything. And that movement is what makes what comes next feel unavoidable. Because when control fails through disease, and fails through drought, and fails through famine, what remains is a final question: how far will power go when what it fears refuses to disappear? By the time I reached this part of the text, after watching the pattern unfold, disease, drought, famine, each one more precise than the last, each one aimed not just at survival, but at breaking something deeper. I expected the system to hold. I expected the pressure to work eventually, because that is how systems like this usually function. They escalate, they tighten, they continue until resistance fades, until whatever is pushing back can no longer continue. But that is not what happens here, because in the middle of all of this, quietly, almost hidden within the structure of the story, there is one figure who does not follow the pattern, one presence that does not align with the decisions being made, one who continues to act even when the direction has already been set, and that figure is Enki. And at first, it is easy to miss what he is doing, because nothing about his actions is loud, nothing about them breaks the system in an obvious way. He does not confront authority directly. He does not stand against the others openly. Instead, he moves quietly, indirectly, almost as if he understands that the system he exists within cannot be challenged head-on. And that alone makes his actions feel different, because while the others act through command, through force, through decisions imposed from above, he operates through something else entirely: guidance, subtle intervention, communication that is not meant to be seen clearly. And I remember slowing down again when I began to notice this pattern, because each time pressure is applied to humanity, each time something is sent to weaken them, there is a response that follows, not random, not accidental, but precise, targeted, as if someone is watching closely enough to understand exactly what needs to be done, and that someone is always him. When disease spreads, he does not remove it directly. He teaches them how to respond, how to adapt, how to shift something within the system so that it cannot fully collapse them. And when drought follows, he does the same, not stopping it entirely, but guiding humanity toward a response that restores what was taken. And again with famine, again with every layer of pressure, he does not break the system, he works within it, but in a way that changes the outcome. And that is when the realization begins to settle in. Because this is not coincidence, this is consistency, a repeated choice, a pattern of action that continues, even when it contradicts the direction of authority. And that raises a question the text does not answer directly, but quietly places in front of you. Why? Why does he keep doing this? Why does he continue to intervene? Not once, not accidentally, but every time the system attempts to eliminate what it created. And I remember sitting with that question longer than anything else, because it does not come with an explanation. It does not resolve itself. And the more I thought about it, the more it began to feel like the key to everything that came before. Because if humanity carries something from the Igigi, if that noise is not just sound, but continuation, then Enki's actions begin to look different. They do not feel like simple kindness or random defiance. They begin to look like protection of something specific, something he recognizes, something others are trying to erase. And that changes the meaning of his role entirely, because now he is not just helping humanity survive. He is preserving something within them, something that would disappear if they were completely removed. And that is where the tension becomes clear, because on one side, there is a system applying pressure, trying again and again to reduce what has become too present, too organized, too difficult to control. And on the other side, there is a single figure moving quietly within that system, preventing it from reaching its conclusion. Not by stopping it entirely, but by redirecting it just enough each time to keep something alive. And I remember thinking very quietly, almost reluctantly, this is not balance, this is conflict, not loud, not visible in the way we usually imagine, but constant, structural, embedded into the story itself. And that is where the question returns, stronger now, more difficult to ignore. Because once you see this pattern, once you recognize that every attempt to destroy humanity is being quietly countered, the focus begins to shift away from what is happening toward why it continues to happen this way. Why one figure refuses to follow the direction of the others. Why he continues to protect something the system has already decided to eliminate. And I remember thinking, if this were only about survival, if this were only about keeping humanity alive, then one intervention might have been enough. But this continues again and again with precision, with intention, and that suggests something deeper, something that connects back to the beginning, to the moment of creation, to what was placed inside humanity in the first place. And that is where the thought settles, quietly, but firmly, because at this point, it is no longer possible to ignore it. There is something within humanity that matters, something worth protecting, something one figure sees clearly, even if the others do not. And that leads to the question that stayed with me longer than anything else. Not what is happening, but why he refuses to let it end, why he continues to act quietly, consistently against the direction of everything else. And I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this is the part that does not explain itself. This is the part that remains just out of reach, because if everything else in the system points toward elimination, then why is there one presence that keeps choosing preservation instead? And that question does not resolve here. It does not answer itself. It lingers just beneath the surface, waiting, as if the story expects you to carry it forward until something else reveals what it means. And even before that answer appears, the feeling is already there. Something about this is not random. Something about this has been intentional from the beginning. And whatever that intention is, it has not revealed itself completely yet. And that is what stayed with me, not the actions themselves, but the question behind them, the one that does not go away, the one that becomes clearer the further you follow the story, but never fully answers itself. Why would he keep doing this? By the time the story reaches this point, after every attempt has already been made, after disease has weakened the body, after drought has stripped the land, after famine has begun to unravel the fragile threads that hold people together, something shifts, not just in what is happening, but in how it is being decided, because up until now, everything has followed a pattern: pressure applied, resistance encountered, quiet intervention from Enki, and then adjustment, as if the system itself were trying to solve a problem it didn't fully understand. But here, that uncertainty disappears, because what comes next is not another attempt, it is a final decision, and the tone of the text changes the moment that decision is made. There is no hesitation, no consideration of alternatives, no gradual escalation, only certainty, a conclusion that has already been reached. And the first thing that defines this moment is not the flood itself. It is the rule that comes before it, a command, absolute, unbreakable. No one is allowed to warn humanity. No one is allowed to interfere. No one is allowed to give even the smallest sign that what is coming can be survived. And that detail stayed with me longer than anything else because it changes the nature of everything that follows. Because if the goal were only destruction, then the method alone would be enough. But this goes further. It removes possibility. It removes preparation. It removes knowledge. And when knowledge is removed, survival becomes almost impossible. I remember pausing there because that realization felt heavier than the flood itself. Not because the flood is insignificant, but because this command reveals intention, a deeper intention, something that goes beyond ending life, something that reaches into the conditions that make life able to continue. And that's when the thought formed quietly, but impossible to ignore. This doesn't feel like an attempt to destroy humanity. It feels like an attempt to erase it, to remove not only its presence, but its continuity, its memory, its ability to return. Because if no one can warn them, if no one can guide them, if no knowledge is allowed to pass forward, then whatever ends in that moment ends completely without trace, without recovery. And that is a very different kind of action. I lean back again, trying to hold on to that distinction, because destruction can be resisted, it can be survived, it can even be reversed over time. But erasure is something else entirely. Erasure removes the path back. It removes the memory that something existed at all. It ensures that even if something remains, it cannot reconnect to what came before it. And that is what makes this command so precise, because it doesn't just control action, it controls information, and control over information is what determines whether anything can continue at all. I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this is the moment where the system stops reacting and starts deciding not just what must end, but how completely it must disappear. And that is where the tension becomes almost unbearable. Because everything we have seen so far suggests that something within humanity cannot be easily removed, that something persists even under pressure, even when weakened, even when broken apart. And now, the system is responding to that persistence, not by applying more pressure, but by removing the conditions that allow persistence to exist at all. No warning, no preparation, no escape. And I remember thinking, this is different. This is not about stopping what humanity is doing. It is about preventing what humanity could become. Because if they survive, if they retain what has been placed within them, then everything that has happened before, the rebellion, the noise, the pattern, all of it could return in a form that would be even harder to control. And that possibility is what this command seems designed to eliminate entirely. And yet, even as that realization settled in, something still felt unresolved. Because if this command is truly absolute, if it binds every god involved, if it leaves no space for intervention, then what happens next becomes difficult to explain. Because we have already seen that one figure does not follow the pattern, one presence who continues to act quietly, even when the direction has been made clear. And that is where the question returns again, stronger now, more urgent. Because if no one is allowed to warn humanity, then how could anything survive at all? And I remember thinking very quietly, almost reluctantly, this is not just about what they are planning to do, it is about whether that plan can truly be carried out the way they intend. Because if even one part of the system refuses to follow the rule, then the idea of complete erasure begins to break apart. And that possibility, quiet as it is, becomes the only thing left to hold on to as the story moves toward its final moment. Because if everything else has failed to eliminate what humanity carries, then the question is no longer whether they will try again, but whether anything can truly be erased at all. I kept returning to that command in my mind, the one that felt so absolute, so final, no warning, no guidance, no space for humanity to prepare for what was coming. And the more I stayed with it, the more it began to feel like the story had reached a point where nothing could intervene anymore. Because if every god had agreed, if every voice had been bound to silence, then the outcome should have been certain. And yet, it isn't. Because something in the pattern breaks, not loudly, not openly, but quietly, carefully, in a way that doesn't challenge the rule directly, and still changes everything that follows. And that is where Enki appears again, not as opposition, not as defiance in the way we usually imagine, but as something far more subtle. And I remember slowing down when I reached this moment. Because the way he acts here is different from everything that came before. Earlier, he guided, he redirected, he influenced outcomes from within the structure. But now, the stakes are different because this is no longer about adjusting pressure. This is about avoiding total erasure. And the rule that has been set leaves no room for direct action. No God is allowed to speak to humanity. No warning can be given. No knowledge can be passed forward, and that is where his method changes. He doesn't break the rule, at least not in any visible way. He doesn't stand against the others. He doesn't speak directly to the one he is trying to save. Instead, he speaks to something else, a wall. And I remember pausing there because at first it feels symbolic, almost poetic, but the longer I stayed with it, the more precise it became. Because by speaking to the wall, he is not technically addressing a human, he is not violating the command itself, and yet the meaning passes through anyway. And that is what makes this moment so significant, because it reveals something about how the system actually works. Rules can be absolute, but interpretation creates space, and within that space, action is still possible, even when it shouldn't be. I leaned back slightly, trying to hold on to that idea because this is not defiance in the usual sense. It is something more controlled, more deliberate, a way of moving through the structure without breaking it visibly. And that is what makes it effective, because while the rule remains intact on the surface, its outcome is already changing underneath, and that is where Atrahasis enters the story, not as a hero in the way we might expect, but as someone who listens. Someone who understands what is being said without it being spoken directly to him. Someone who receives meaning that was never meant to reach him. And that detail matters because it shows that survival here is not about strength. It is about awareness, about recognizing something even when it is hidden. And I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like rescue, not in the way I expected. It feels like transmission. Something passing through a barrier, something finding a path forward even when every path has been closed. And that is when the insight becomes clearer. This is not just intervention, it is navigation, a way of moving within a system to prevent exactly this outcome. And that makes it something more than resistance. It becomes a method, a pattern of working within constraints, of finding the edges of what is allowed, and using them to change what happens next. And I remember thinking, almost instinctively, this is how something survives when it is not supposed to. Not by breaking everything openly, but by understanding the structure well enough to move through it. And that realization shifts everything that follows, because if even a rule like this can be navigated, if even a command designed to erase completely can be bypassed in this way, then the idea of total control begins to weaken, and with it, the idea of total erasure. Because now we have seen that something can pass through even the strictest boundary, knowledge, instruction, possibility, all carried forward through a path that technically should not exist. And that is what stayed with me the most, not just that Atrahasis survives, but how that survival becomes possible through a method that does not oppose the system directly and still changes its outcome completely. And that raises a question that lingers even after the moment passes. If something can survive under these conditions, if something can be carried forward even when every rule is designed to prevent it, then what exactly is being preserved here? What is so important that it finds a way through every barrier placed against it? And I remember thinking, quietly, almost reluctantly, maybe the system was never built to handle this kind of persistence. Maybe it was designed to control actions, but not to erase what has already been embedded deeply enough. And if that is true, then what follows is not just survival, it is proof. Proof that something cannot be fully removed once it has been passed forward, no matter how absolute the rules appear on the surface, because even here, at the point where everything should have ended, something still continues, quietly, carefully, through a path that was never meant to exist. I expected the flood to feel like an ending, something final, something that would close everything that had been building for so long. Because when a story reaches that scale, when water rises beyond everything familiar, covering land, memory, movement, all at once, it usually signals resolution. But that is not what I found here. Not at all, because after the flood recedes, after the silence that follows something so complete, the tone does not shift toward victory. It shifts into something else, something quieter, something that feels almost like regret. And that is what stayed with me the most, because the text does not describe the gods celebrating what they have done. It does not describe control being restored in any clear way. Instead, it describes hunger. The gods themselves, the Anunnaki, begin to weaken, not from conflict, not from resistance, but from absence, because the humans are gone or nearly gone, and without them, something essential is missing. I remember pausing there again because this was not what I expected. If humans were created to carry the burden, if they were introduced as a solution, then removing them should have restored balance. But it doesn't. It creates another imbalance instead. And that is when the realization begins to settle in. The system was not just using humanity, it had become dependent on it, quietly, gradually, almost without acknowledging it. And now that dependence is exposed in the most direct way possible, the gods hunger. They wait. They gather around the absence of offerings that no longer come. And that image is difficult to ignore because it reverses something fundamental. The ones who once commanded now need something from what they created. And without it, they weaken, they become incomplete. And I remember thinking, this is not restoration, this is loss. Because whatever was removed in the flood did not only exist below, it existed above as well, in the structure that depended on it, in the balance that had formed over time. And now that balance is broken on both sides. And that is where the feeling becomes heavier, because the text does not stop at hunger, it moves further towards something more emotional, something harder to define. The Igigi, they cry. And I remember reading that line again, just to be certain, because it changes everything. This is not relief. This is not satisfaction. This is grief. And grief does not appear without connection, without something being lost that mattered. And that is where the story shifts again, because now the Igigi are no longer defined by their rebellion or their burden, or even their role in creation. They are defined by what they feel in its absence, and that feeling is immediate, visible, shared. And that is what makes it so significant, because if they mourn what has been removed, then what was removed was not just a replacement, it was something more, something that had become part of them, even if it existed in another form. And I remember thinking, quietly, almost unwilling to accept it fully. This does not look like a system that has resolved its problem. It looks like a system that has lost something it did not realize it needed. And that changes the meaning of the flood completely, because instead of a clean ending, it becomes a rupture, something that leaves both sides altered in ways that cannot be undone easily. The humans are nearly gone, but the gods are no longer whole either. And that shared loss is what gives this moment its weight, because it suggests that whatever connection existed between them was never one-sided, it was mutual, even if it was never acknowledged openly before. And that is where the feeling settles most clearly. This is not victory. This is absence, and absence has its own kind of presence. It lingers, it reshapes what comes next. It creates space for something to return or to be rebuilt. Because once something has existed within a system long enough, removing it does not restore what was before. It creates something new, something incomplete, something that cannot continue in the same way. And I remember thinking, if this was meant to end everything, then why does it feel like the beginning of something else instead? Why does it feel like the story has not resolved but shifted into a quieter, more uncertain form? And that uncertainty is what stayed with me more than the flood itself, because it suggests that even at this scale, even after everything has been taken away, something still remains, not visible, not fully formed, but present, waiting for what comes next. I stayed with that feeling for a long time, longer than I expected, because something about the ending didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt incomplete, not in the sense of missing pieces, but in the sense that something had continued quietly beneath everything that had just happened. And the more I thought about it, the harder it became to accept the flood as a total erasure, because even within the text itself, there are traces that refuse to disappear. Not loud, not obvious, but persistent. And that persistence changes everything, because if something truly ends, it leaves nothing behind, no continuation, no influence, no return. But that's not what happens here. The story moves forward. Humanity continues, not in the same form, not in the same scale, but it does not vanish completely. And that alone is enough to shift the meaning of everything that came before it. I remember thinking, if the intention was absolute erasure, then why does anything remain? Why is there still presence, still life, still a thread that connects what existed before the flood to what comes after it? And that's where the earlier details begin to return, quietly, almost as if they were waiting for this moment. The mixture of clay and divine blood, the participation of the entity mythological group Igigi, Igigi never meant to be purely physical, and most of all, the presence of that noise, that rigmu, that voice that had already once changed everything before. Because if those elements were truly embedded into humanity, then removing the physical form doesn't necessarily remove what was placed inside it. And that's when the idea becomes harder to ignore. The essence remains, not as something you can see directly, not as something the text describes in simple terms, but as something that continues to shape what comes after. And that's where the meaning of survival changes completely, because it's no longer just about bodies continuing, it's about something deeper, something carried forward through each new beginning. Something that doesn't depend entirely on form to exist. I leaned back again, letting that thought settle, because it wasn't just a conclusion, it was a question that the text never answers directly, but builds toward with every detail it gives you. If the noise was feared before, if it represented something that could organize, that could push back, that could disrupt a system that once seemed stable, then its survival matters more than anything else in the story, because it means that what was feared was never fully removed, and that changes the ending completely. Because now the flood isn't the final act of control. It's an attempt that doesn't fully succeed, an attempt that leaves something behind, something that cannot be easily erased once it has been passed forward. And that's when the realization becomes clear. Quietly, but undeniably, this wasn't just about ending humanity. It was about ending what humanity carried. And that's the part that doesn't disappear. The essence remains, the pattern remains, the capacity for noise remains, even if it changes form, even if it becomes less visible, even if it takes time to appear again in the same way. And I remember thinking, if that's true, then the story hasn't really ended at all. It has simply moved into a different phase, one where what once existed openly now exists quietly, waiting, building, carrying forward something that cannot be fully removed once it has taken root. And that's where the final question begins to form, not as a conclusion, but as something that stays with you, something that doesn't resolve itself easily. If they tried to erase this completely, if they removed everything they could, and still something remained, then maybe the real question isn't about what happened in the past. Maybe it's about what continues in the present. Because if that essence, that noise, that capacity for collective voice was placed into humanity from the beginning, And if it survived everything that was meant to remove it, then it hasn't disappeared. It hasn't been erased. It hasn't been lost to time. It has simply continued quietly within us. And I don't know why, but that thought felt different from everything else in the story. More immediate, more difficult to set aside, because it shifts the focus away from the past entirely and brings it somewhere much closer, somewhere that doesn't feel distant anymore. And I remember thinking very quietly, almost as if I wasn't sure I wanted to ask it at all, if they tried to erase this and failed, then the question isn't just what happened back then, it's whether it still exists now, whether that same pattern, that same voice, that same capacity to gather, to organize, to resist, is still part of what defines us, even if we don't recognize it clearly, even if we've forgotten where it came from. And that's where the story leaves you, not with an answer, but with something much harder to ignore, a possibility. That what was once feared enough to be erased was never truly gone, just carried forward into something that continues to exist, quietly within us.